The United States has been profoundly shaped by three wars: the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and the Second World War. During each one of these wars, the planet Uranus was in the sign of Gemini. And Uranus is moving into Gemini again in July 2025. Is another war that reshapes the United States on the way? In this episode of World Astrology Report, I'm once again joined by S.J. Anderson, and we're going to explore the transit of Uranus through Gemini, one of the major pieces of the astrology of the 2020s.
America seems to be set for some major change, and that's really the major theme of this video. We're going to look at all of these points of information that are all pointing to this same idea. America in 2030 will probably look a lot different than America in 2020, whether civil war, whether war with a foreign power, whether some kind of new constitution that may emerge, or new global agreements with other nations, new economic agreements, new banking structures.
In the last video, we saw how Russian history responds like clockwork to the Saturn-Neptune synodic cycle. In this video, we're going to see how the Uranus cycle seems to play a similar role in American history. And funnily enough, it's not only astrologers who've noticed that pattern. A lot of geopolitical and political science specialists are predicting that the late 2020s is going to be a period of crisis for the United States. But before we get to that, we need to think about the planet Uranus. It's the planet astrologers tend to associate with themes like freedom, upheaval, revolution, technology, and the new.
Uranus, discovered in 13 March 1781, it's the first planet that's discovered that's not a traditional planet. Think about how much of a breakthrough that is, where for thousands of years, astrologers and astronomers said there's only these 5 planets that are not the sun or the moon. And then in 1781, there's a new planet on the scene. What a breakthrough and a kind of sudden shift in the sense of what the world even is. And that's a major signification of Uranus: sudden breakthroughs, deviations from the norm that happen quite fast. And in the wake of this discovery, we have to rewrite histories, rewrite cosmologies, rebuild whole understandings of planetary and astrological reality. I think with astrology, the longer we can work with a planet or planetary point, the more we understand or can develop its meaning. You come into the 20th century, there's some astrologers I like to refer to. Isabel Hickey, she's got Astrology, a Cosmic Science, her seminal text. She says it's unexpected, sudden, unpredictable changes, rebelliousness, which will be a key signification for some of the themes we're going to look at historically, electricity, right? The shock of electricity. It shocks. And then the other astrologer I want to mention is Richard Tarnas, wrote Cosmos and Psyche. And he's likens Uranus to Prometheus, the deliverer of fire from the gods to humanity. And this is where you get the sense of rebellion. Saturn formerly was the planet that had the longest orbital cycle, or the longest cycle of movement through all 12 zodiac signs, of about 29 years, 29 and a half years. For Uranus, it takes 84 years to move through all 12 signs. So it really does change how we think about astrology. We have a planet that's a much longer cycle. And that's what this video is about. It's about mapping that Uranus cycle and the correlations that are quite fascinating when you look at the United States of America. And so it's interesting. I think Uranus and Gemini is maybe a bit more weighted and a bit more notable, given that the discovery of Uranus happened while it was in Gemini. I think it tells us something about how important these transits of Uranus through Gemini are. And when you look at America, which was also born in this same period, with Uranus and Gemini, it's almost like America and Uranus are tied together. It's maybe an American planet. What does America represent to some? Definitely around the world, they see America as freedom, a signification of Uranus in these textbooks. America is born out of a rebellion.
But why would Uranus going into Gemini in particular seem to signify American wars? This has to do with the natal chart of the United States. Every natal chart is based on a moment of inception, when the thing concerned can be said to have begun. With a person, of course, it's birth. But with something like a nation state, it will tend to be some other important moment of launch, the signing of a document or a declaration, for example. And that's precisely what we see with the United States. For the United States, a lot of astrologers take this to be the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776. but the exact time when the declaration was signed isn't known for sure. Now, the 18th century English astrologer and occultist Ebenezer Sibly took the time of about 10 past 5 in the afternoon. So if we use that time, we get a natal chart that most astrologers refer to as the Sibly chart.
It's kind of the most popular root chart for America. It's the one I've used because I found it to be quite accurate. There's something about that chart that's speaking accurately about America and what's happening to America.
Now, regardless of which chart you use, Uranus was in Gemini at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And the Sibly chart has Sagittarius rising. So if you're using the whole sign houses system, that makes Gemini the 7th house of the chart. And if we look at what planets are in Gemini, we find Uranus and Mars, the war planet. The 7th house is also the house of the other. It can speak to partners, but it was also said to speak to open enemies. When somebody becomes our enemy, they're our opponent. They confront us. They appear in front of us, and we gain a kind of intimacy with them, one perhaps only rivaled by the intimacy of lovers.
What do we know already? Uranus is flash, breakthrough, rebellion around these foreign relationships with other foreign nations. What would come to mind? Pearl Harbor, right?
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards. Costly to our Navy was the loss of war vessels, airplanes, and equipment. But more costly to Japan was the effectiveness of its foul attack in immediately unifying America in its determination to fight and win the war thrust upon it.
Whenever Uranus transits Gemini, it triggers the Sibly chart Mars and it triggers the Sibly chart Uranus. America has always been at war.
Let's start all the way back in the late 18th century, the Enlightenment period, when the US came into being.
So Uranus comes into Gemini the first time, 19 June 1774. So most often there's going to be a transition period with Uranus ingresses where there's a retrogradation back into Taurus and then back into Gemini. In the 18th century, the final ingress of Uranus into Gemini takes place on 8 April 1775. And then on the 19th of April, the battles of Lexington and Concord take place, kicking off the Revolutionary War. Outer planets, when they ingress into a sign, this is a great example of how loud they can be upon the days in the immediate aftermath of their ingress, often really change things immediately. The Treaty of Paris that ends the Revolutionary War comes in 1783. It was drafted in late 1782 and then signed 3 September 1783 after Uranus had left Gemini the final time. Pretty much the whole of the transit, except for that first period of Uranus in Gemini in 1774, was war for America. The aftermath of Uranus in Gemini in the 18th century, America again then gets to build its institutions. It gets to have a constitution, which comes in the 1780s after the war. The actual constitution that exists today doesn't come until about 10 years later. The first president doesn't get elected until that period after Uranus leaves Gemini. So there's this kind of rebuilding phase that is foundational for the structures of the American political society and governmental structure. And Pluto was in Aquarius.
If we look at the Revolutionary War, Pluto was in Capricorn when it broke out in 1775, and in early Aquarius when it ended in 1783. That was also the time of the French Revolution, when the French monarchy was overthrown and a new state was founded based on more egalitarian principles. As we've seen, the Uranus cycle is 84 years long. So let's fast forward one Uranus cycle to the middle of the 19th century. We're reaching the time of the Civil War.
So let's just get the dates clear of Uranus's ingress into Gemini in the mid-19th century. You have Uranus coming for the very first time into Gemini in 1858 on 2nd June. It regresses back into Taurus and then finally enters Gemini on 14 March 1859. So a couple of years before the Civil War begins. And then Uranus leaves Gemini in 1865 for the first time, goes back into Gemini, and then finally leaves Gemini on 27 March 1866. So you again can see Uranus in Gemini is almost an exact timer for war. It was pretty close in the Revolutionary War. It's darn close in the case of the US Civil War. It really makes us, as astrologers, say, wow.
Once again, we should consider what planets beside Uranus were doing at the time of these events. The Civil War is held to have begun on April the 12th, 1861, with the Battle of Fort Sumter. Uranus was already in Gemini at this time, together with Mars. That's important because both of those planets are in Gemini in the Sibly chart. But the battle began just one day before Neptune entered the sign of Aries.
A major theme of this series is the interrelationships between outer planets, the basket of 2026, how they're forming relationships to each other. The case of the US Civil War is special because you get two of the basket participants mirroring each other. You get Neptune in Aries and Uranus in Gemini, as they were during this US Civil War moment.
So after the Civil War, the United States was preserved as one nation, and it did away with the institution of slavery, even if its consequences remain with us to this day.
So remember, Uranus can signify rebellion, but it can also signify freedom. Rebellion and freedom go hand in hand. In this case, you have the freedom of slaves. Quite literally, this war is fought to free slaves, and that is the result of this Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and slavery is over. And this all happens with Uranus in Gemini, the planet of freedom, the planet of liberation, the planet of breaking chains. And it's interesting because it's also a global phenomenon that happens during this Uranus and Gemini transit. Russia freed their serfs by decree of the Tsar during this same period. And so we can look for that just as a theme as we think about second half of this decade. How might we want freedom or need freedom? It's a major, major theme. Who needs freeing?
Now let's move forward again in time by one Uranus cycle. We reach a very different time, the early 20th century.
So Uranus first enters Gemini 7 August 1941 in the 20th century. Should have bells going off. 4 months later, almost to the day, that you get the big event of 1941 for America, which was the attack of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese planes dropped bombs on the carriers and the Navy that was there in Hawaii. And that triggers America's involvement in World War II. So while Uranus first ingressed into Gemini 4 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the attack actually happens when Uranus is back into Taurus. So it's actually during the transition of Uranus through Gemini, back into Taurus, and then back into Gemini that America is now at war.
The whole world was transformed by the Second World War, America included. The US emerged extremely powerful with a global empire. And in the aftermath of that war, many of the institutions that undergird the current world order were founded: the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, and the Bretton Woods system, which established the US dollar as the global reserve currency. I think it's safe to say that this order is going to be challenged over this coming decade.
So just to sum up here, Uranus into Gemini has America at war. That's the simplest way to look at this. And why it's important is because we're about to experience another one. In this decade, 7 July 2025, Uranus enters Gemini for the first time, and Uranus enters Gemini for good 26 April 2026. And upon that second entry, we're now forming the basket, Andre Barbeau's basket, which he says is the most elegant, sweet astrology of the whole century, emerges right here mid-decade. An interesting thing about astrology, astrologers are dealing with multiple cycles and multiple, sometimes competing pieces of astrological evidence to make a delineation. And this is a case of that, where Barbeau is very optimistic about Uranus and Gemini. He says it's going to be the most elegant configuration in a new world civilization. Whereas if we isolate one component and look at the history and cycle of America at war with Uranus and Gemini, it kind of is some competing testimony here. And of course, I don't know what the outcomes are. No one knows. I'm a pray for peace astrologer. I want peace to emerge. But we would not be doing our job if we didn't acknowledge the real risk of some kind of American conflict or conflict with America starting about mid-decade.
What we're going to see now is that it's not only astrologers who think there's crisis on the way for the United States, and not only astrologers who are using cycles to make that deduction. Geopolitical and political science analysts working outside of the astrological tradition have seen it too. Perhaps best known of all is the fourth turning.
William Strauss and Neil Howe published a book in 1997 called The Fourth Turning, An American Prophecy. And in this book, they conclude the 2020s are a key decade for a major change in the American collective, body politic, psyche, all of it.
We also have the geopolitical analyst George Friedman, whose book, The Storm Before the Calm, predicts a massive crisis for the United States in the second half of the 2020s. Friedman believes there are two cycles operating in American history, one roughly 80 years long, ring any bells, and another roughly 50 years long. The 80-year cycle that Friedman refers to is the Uranus cycle that we're referring to. It's the cycle in which the United States gets involved in wars. Friedman calls it the institutional cycle because it results in a crisis of American institutions, which reshapes America. But he also sees a 50-year cycle concerning how the economy is organized and which social classes benefit most from it. This cycle culminates with a period of intense economic difficulty, such as the 1930s, the period of the Great Depression, and the 1970s, the time of the stagflation crisis. But both these periods coincide with the waning squares of the Saturn-Uranus cycle, which I've also covered in a video on this channel. But Friedman thinks that both this 80-year cycle and the 50-year cycle are reaching critical phases at the same time in the late 2020s. He thinks this will be an incredibly testing time for the US, but that it will emerge stronger afterwards. And we also have the billionaire investor Ray Dalio.
Hugely successful guy, one of the richest men in the world. So Ray Dalio publishes in 2022 The Changing World Order, where he analyzes cycles of global power and cycles of nations being the strongest country in the world. And he concludes that America is coming into a period that may include war, that may include economic changes as a result of being over-leveraged and too much debt in the system, and that there's a moment here that's ripe for the emergence of a new power or a new structure or a new system.
He predicts that the US dollar is going to lose its status as the global reserve currency, and he sees this as the result of an inevitable cyclical process which has happened many times before. He thinks the likely candidate to replace the dollar is the Chinese yuan. So all these analysts see cycles at work in history, and whether they know it or not, they're essentially doing astrology, except without the planets. Of course, it's possible that they know very well that's what they're doing and just keep quiet for credibility's sake. So what's coming? There are lots of possibilities.
So one way to think about this video is just America's challenge, rebirth, America at war, as the major theme of this cycle. And it's not just Uranus and Gemini. I mean, if we're going to talk about America's challenge at this decade, the 2020s, we can layer in some other astrology here that's highly relevant. The first major technique would be the Pluto return itself. Pluto will be in Capricorn in those late degrees where it was during the signing of the Declaration of Independence, where Pluto is in the Sibly chart in the 28th degree. There's 3 passes, exact passes of the Pluto return. All of them happened in 2022. Of course, then when Pluto moves forward in the zodiac, every year after 2022, now you get Pluto returns for all of the events that happened in early America and during the Revolutionary War, during the 1780s, during the 1790s. So Pluto is now triggering a series of Pluto returns for all of that early phase of America. What is Pluto? Death and rebirth, fundamentally. Transformation. The little becomes large and totally transforms.
For example, the Constitution wasn't effective until March the 4th, 1789. At that time, Pluto was at 18 degrees of Aquarius. Pluto won't return to that position until 2034. So bear that in mind when you're thinking about what's coming over the next decade.
The next technique we can layer in is that there are a series of 3 visible solar eclipses that make eclipse paths through America. There was the Great American Eclipse in 2017, we might call the Trump eclipse, because there's that famous image of him actually looking at the sun. Everybody says, don't look at the sun. And that president's up there looking at it and smiling. But it brought into America the struggles that related to Trumpism and January 6th and this kind of division in the society where you have right and left and both sides not talking as much and accusing the other of violating laws. So there's an annular solar eclipse, October 14th, 2023, that runs through California and Oregon, down through Texas, right through the center of Texas and through those western states. And then there's a total solar eclipse on 8 April 2024 that runs up through Mexico, right again through Texas, and then right through the Midwestern states and up into Maine. And so Texas is right in the crosshairs of these next two solar eclipses that are visible in America. Texas is a prime candidate state. It's my home state. Texas brought its gold back at some point from New York over the last few years. There's been conversation in Texas my whole life about secession. There are people in Texas that want to secede or that are ready to secede. So this is, with these eclipses, it might be pointed to some kind of Texas secession, or Texas as representative of this red state bloc that has been at odds with the federal government. With the eclipse technique, that is certainly an interesting concept and one we would have to consider.
But what about a foreign war? Well, right now, needless to say, we have a war in Europe that the United States is already deeply involved in. And we have a lot of saber rattling over Taiwan. Chinese President Xi Jinping has made reunification of Taiwan with the mainland an explicit goal. And at the same time, we have states outside of America's current network of alliances seemingly lining up to try to overturn the current financial order. We saw in the last video that we have the BRICS countries potentially moving to create a new global reserve currency. And we're seeing a number of important developing nations applying to join the BRICS. Question of which currency is the global reserve is hugely important. It would have a huge effect on American power and the American economy. So these moves really threaten America's status as the world's preeminent power. We can expect it to take action to try to prevent this.
The 2026 brings some very elegant astrological configurations that are very much new and different compared to the years before those configurations arrive. All outer planets will have changed signs by April 2026. And the Neptune conjunction with Saturn at 0 Aries seems to be indicative of some changes in terms of how money is distributed through the world, changes in terms of new boundaries or borders or frontiers of what's possible even. Andre Barbeau, the famous astrologer, claims and was very optimistic about this transit in 2026 as being the best astrology of the century that will usher in a new civilization that is egalitarian, lifting up poor people from all over the world. And then we have this Uranus cycle with Uranus in Gemini. Every time it's happened since America came into existence, Uranus in Gemini has brought about war for America. We know we're living in an age of air. Warfare might not be kinetic, right? In this age of air, it could be information war, financial war, wars in the metaverse, wars online. Let's hope for humanity's sake that it's not a kinetic war, because that will kill a lot of people likely. We don't want that. It's horrible. Pray for peace. But these techniques all seem to indicate that there's a shifting role of America in the global landscape, and there might be the emergence of a multipolar world order or a new reserve currency where America may be reintegrating into the larger human family and the larger family of nations. And this decade will bring about that reintegration.
That's it for this video. In the next one and the final one of this series, we're going to look at the airy nature of our current era. We have Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions now taking place in air signs. This is an age of air. And we have Pluto about to move into Aquarius, which seems to be saying something very similar. In previous transits has signified revolutions of different kinds. See you next time.